It's been right there for everybody to see for thousands of years. Point 4 of the text downloaded to Moses' tablet. Thou shalt not steal. If you didn't acquire something legally and morally, then it's not yours and you can't take it. But humans, being a thieving species, we need that spelled out in our religious texts and legal codes. And still, we steal a lot. Money, food, clothing, cars, mobile phones, alcohol, drugs, jewelry, horses, razor blades, and music. There are two main ways to steal music. Claim or copy something someone else has written as your own creation. That's plagiarism. Or illegally acquire a finished piece of music without properly compensating the creator and the owners who hold the rights to that song. The music problem goes back centuries, but it became a global issue starting in the 1990s. And there has been no end to people who are willing to steal music or to facilitate its theft. I'm Alan Cross, and this time on Uncharted, Crime and Mayhem in the Music Industry, we're going to look at these people, the pirates who made stealing music possible, and how they did it. These are brazen, colorful, weird, and occasionally clueless people behind all that illegal and often free music that's out there. And boy, have I got some stories for you. Hello again, and on episode 34 of Uncharted, we're going to look at the mayhem created by the people who made it possible and easy to steal music. The music pirates, who nearly brought down the recorded music industry. At the very least, they forced the industry to transition from the physical realm into the digital one a lot faster than it really wanted to. Now, you're probably already familiar with things like bootleg recordings, names like Napster and the Pirate Bay, as well as technologies like BitTorrent. But what about the real people behind these things? That's going to be the focus of this show. Music theft has been an issue for centuries. Not long after Johann Gutenberg unveiled his printing press in 1440, it was being used to not only make unauthorized copies of books, but sheet music, which was then sold by people who had no right to sell it and then pocketed all the proceeds themselves. And like I said, this sheet music bootlegging went on for hundreds of years. The first copyright laws that literally spelled out who had the right to copy someone else's work, appeared in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Let's follow that thread first. Copyright laws first covered the printed word. The first protection for sheet music seems to have been enacted in England in the late 18th century. There was a big crisis in Chicago in 1892 and 93 when unauthorized sheet music flooded the streets, but that was contained and snuffed out rather quickly. Now let me read you something from the New York Times in 1897. Canadian pirates are what the music dealers call publishing houses across the line, who are flooding this country, they say, with spurious editions of the latest copyrighted popular songs. They use the mails to reach purchasers, and as a result, the legitimate music publishing business of the United States has fallen off 50% in the last 12 months. Meanwhile, Tin Pan Alley, that area of New York City once famous for all its songwriting offices, was always dealing with music theft. In 1929, Tin Pan Alley's music publishers convinced the cops in New York to engage in a series of raids on offices where sheet music was being illegally duplicated. In April 1930, there was a crackdown on people selling illegal copies of song sheets up and down Broadway between 42nd and 43rd Street. A traffic patrolman named Broger made the first arrest. And it was an 80-year-old woman named Sarah Yagoda. She was selling lyrics to 100 hit songs of the day for 5 cents. Paul Fischoff, a representative of the music publishers, said that his industry was losing several $1 million a year to scams like this. Sarah was interrogated in hopes of her dropping a dime on the racketeers behind all this. So she told them what she knew and the charges were dropped. But investigators never did find out where those song sheets were being printed. Despite the crackdown, sales of illegal sheet music continued on the streets of New York, especially around Times Square. Even the famous gangster Al Capone was caught up in a connection with a music publisher that was robbed at gunpoint, but Capone was never charged for anything to do with music piracy. Turns out that there were some illegal activities that he just wouldn't touch. In 1949, there was another crisis when the Xerox copier arrived. It was used on plenty of sheet music, but prosecutions were few and far between. Such piracy continues today, but it's dwarfed by the theft of sound recordings. Bootlegs, unauthorized copies of sound recordings, are about as old as the technology itself. Thomas Edison introduced his talking machine, the phonograph, in 1877. And as soon as musicians and record labels began selling recordings made on Edison cylinders, there were thieves making copies. Because of the way it worked, duplicating an Edison cylinder was tricky. The easiest way was to have one talking machine record a cylinder playing on another. But because the audio quality of the original wasn't very good, a copy made by recording through-the-air playback was even worse. And everything had to be duplicated this way one at a time. So if you wanted 100 bootlegs that you could sell, then you had to go through the playback and recording procedure 100 times. Labels of the era knew what was going on, so they emphasized the need to buy the original because that was the only way to hear the music loud and clear. Articles and ads appeared in magazines with titles like The Phonoscope, a monthly journal devoted to scientific and amusement inventions appertaining to sound and sight, and they urged people not to be taken in by these inferior-sounding copies. Then we have Lionel Mapleson. He has gone down in history as the father of bootlegging, although when he started doing his thing, it wasn't illegal. Mapleson was originally a classical musician who ended up as the chief librarian at the Metropolitan Opera in New York. In early 1900, he bought an Edison talking machine and was immediately smitten. That's when a friend bought him a Bettini, a brand of phonograph using Edison's technology that was capable of recording up to 2 minutes of audio using wax cylinders. It was about the size of a suitcase and actually quite portable for its day. Mapleson kept a diary. On March 22, 1900, he wrote, "For the present, I neither work properly, nor eat, nor sleep. I am a phonograph maniac, always making or buying records. The Bettini apparatus is simply perfect." Mapleson immediately saw the potential in recording performances at the Met from a perch high on a catwalk above the stage, maybe 40 feet high. Not all recordings were kept. If Mapleson thought it was a subpar performance or recording, he erased the cylinders by carefully shaving the grooves out of the wax and then reusing that cylinder. There's some dispute as to whether he made and sold recordings in secret or if he actually sought permission from the Met and the musicians. Anyway, here's an example of what he captured. It's a performance of Tosca from 1903. At first, no one really seemed to mind what Mapleson was doing. The biggest complaints came from some members of the audience who were annoyed that the big horn he needed to capture the sound from the stage blocked their view. Mapleson made about 120 of these very fragile cylinder recordings over about 3 years before he suddenly stopped. Probably because the Met found out, and they wanted to start making and selling their own recordings, not some employee up in the loft. But still, Mapleson kept his job as librarian and stayed in the position for 52 years. Lionel Mapleson died of a heart attack on December 21, 1937, and in 1939, many of those impossible to mass-produce recordings started to be converted to 10-inch 78 RPM records. Over the years, other Mapleson recordings have turned up, and if you're curious, there's a collection available known as the Mapleson Cylinders, featuring about 100 performances. Then we have Wynant Van Zandt Pierce Bradley. He started making illegal copies for a label called Zonophone in 1902. He made a deal with the Ohio Talking Machine Company to build a line of units that were very close to those made by the Victor Company, makers of the famous Victrola. The various models of these machines were given the names of famous composers, without, of course, asking for permission. This collaboration between Zonophone and the Ohio Talking Machine Company went on for several years before the Ohio people were sued out of existence for patent infringement. Meanwhile, Bradley continued to pirate recordings for his label Continental Records. He was then sued by an Italian label called Phonotopia for duplicating some opera recordings that were legally licensed to Columbia Records, and this set off a series of court cases that lasted for almost 20 years. Britain was the first company to recognize that sound recordings needed copyright protection, along with the printed word and sheet music. The first laws went into effect in 1911. The United States didn't get around to properly dealing with the matter until, believe it or not, 1972. Our next pirates are those associated with the Hot Record Society, a record label beloved by jazz fans who reissued obscure recordings, out-of-print records, and occasionally recordings made by audience members. In the 1930s, they used acetate recorders, machines that etched audio onto a rotating disc that could later be transferred to 10-inch 78 RPM records. And by the 1940s, they were using brand new reel-to-reel recorders to capture these performances. All of this was technically illegal, but jazz fans were so frustrated at not being able to buy records of their favorite artists, especially recordings of live gigs. So the thinking was that these bootleggers were actually doing everyone a favor, archiving this music when no one else would. For example, a lot of the legend of Charlie Parker would have been lost, if not for someone in the audience recording him. Here he is performing with Dizzy Gillespie in New York in 1947. Total bootleg. These benevolent and beloved bootleggers eventually forced record labels to get into the business of jazz. But there were still issues. In the early 1950s, a jazz label called, and I'm not making this up, Jolly Roger started issuing unauthorized recordings. Their existence was one of the things that prompted the creation of the Recording Industry Association of America, a representative trade body that would in part pursue music pirates. Now, being a pirate was tough. To pull it off at scale, a pirate needed to have access to a record pressing plant somehow. This was hard because the vast majority of plants controlled the manufacturing very, very tightly. And because it was way too expensive to build a pressing plant, pirates needed to cultivate relationships with plants with independent owners looking to make a few extra bucks on the side. According to a 1951 report in Billboard magazine, there were 4 plants in the New York City area cranking out 50,000 bootlegs a week. And all this was supervised by an unknown pirate using multiple aliases and bank accounts. By the late 50s and early 60s, pressing plants all over the world had a plan. They would take an order for a run of legitimate records, but press up, just a few extra. That extra undocumented inventory would be then sold as bootlegs to places like supermarkets and drugstores. Who organized this? Sometimes private individuals, but a lot of these activities were connected to the mob. You needed their kind of muscle if you were going to first hijack a record pressing plant and then insist that stores carry this illicit product. Then, in 1969, a shift, and it was all due to a couple of hippies who had some interesting product in the trunk of their car. This episode of Uncharted is all about the real people behind the pirating of music over the decades. We're now up to July 1969 when some Bob Dylan tapes shook up the recording industry. Dylan was one of the most important and mysterious artists of the 1960s. Hardcore fans would do anything to learn more about the man and his music. So 2 hippies known as Ken and Dub were only too happy to help. It's unclear how, but they somehow came into possession of 24 unreleased Bob Dylan songs, representing about 2 hours of unheard gold. These recordings were made between 1961 and 1967 in a variety of locations: a performance on Johnny Cash's TV show, a hotel room in Minnesota, some studio outtakes. Tracks recorded with the band, but never released. We're talking alternate takes of familiar songs, strange covers, unknown originals, and more. Ken and Dub found a sympathetic owner of a record pressing plant, probably someplace in Southern California, who manufactured a double vinyl album they called Great White Wonder. Now, why that title? because it was packaged in a plain white sleeve with zero printed information. The label was listed as trademark of quality. Here's a sample. Recordings like that from Great White Wonder were released without permission of Bob Dylan or his record label. And of course, neither Dylan nor his label made any money from this venture. Copies of Great White Wonder circulated quickly, and FM radio stations on the U.S. West Coast started playing tracks. And the presence of this album only made Dylan more special and mysterious. It actually boosted his career. Fans loved it. It is said that Ken and Dub made a small fortune from this little endeavor. It also inspired others to try the same sort of thing, and it wasn't long before bootleg records from acts like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin began to appear. Indie record stores kept copies behind the counter for special trusted customers. Bootlegs were sold at places like flea markets, and because the cassette had just become a useful tool, these recordings were exchanged between fans. Record companies were obviously not happy. Such albums forced them to take a very hard look at how they were managing, storing, and dispensing of unreleased material from their artists. And they did not like how their exclusive dominion over ownership and distributions of artists on their roster had been compromised. We can trace the rise of today's comprehensive box sets to the impact of Great White Wonder, and such releases also forced the Recording Industry Association of America to step things up further when it came to stomping out piracy and bootlegs. A 24-hour snitch line was set up in the 1970s in case anyone wanted to report something fishy. This created plenty of tension between labels, artists, and fans. In 1979 and 1980, there was another bump in bootlegging. By this time, the use of cassettes had spread everywhere. Putting out bootleg albums on cassette was far easier and far cheaper than doing a deal with a vinyl plant somewhere. These cassettes sometimes turned up in big chain record stores. Sam Goody, a big American chain, was hit with charges of racketeering, interstate transportation of stolen property, and the unauthorized distribution of copyrighted sound recordings when bootleg cassettes were found in some locations. That included 23,000 counterfeit copies of the Grease soundtrack, along with albums from Olivia Newton-John and Paul Simon. Cassettes became a real sore point. If you're of that era, you'll probably remember making mixtapes and sometimes making recordings of albums your friends had. This led to a big push against home taping by the music industry. A real panic set in September 1981 when a company called Amstrad released a dual cassette machine called the TS-55. One side was play only. The other side was play and record. So this meant that dubbing one cassette to another was a breeze. You had this one unit and it could do it all. "It tapes tapes," said the ads. The industry threatened legal action, but in the end, the British House of Lords had to rule on everything, saying that, yeah, this machine can tape tapes, but it doesn't authorize people to tape tapes. Therefore, Amstrad cannot be liable for what its customers do with these machines. Meanwhile, a Canadian from Kitchener, Ontario named Kurt Glemser had become a hero in the bootleg community. In 1973, he began publishing guides to illegal recordings out in the wild. And by 1975, he had a quarterly publication called Hot Wax, followed by a series of books by the same name. Each edition listed artists, titles, details about the content, track listings, its audio quality, a description of the packaging, names of bootleg labels, catalog numbers, and more. There was nothing illegal about these books, but because they dealt with something that was not, labels and right holders were not always happy with Glemser. Hot Wax went through 15 editions over 25 years. The final printed edition ran more than 800 pages, and Hot Wax still exists online as hotwax.com. The bootleg market continued to grow throughout the 1980s. One of the most popular series of illegal recordings came under the title Ultra Rare Tracks. The first release featured some Beatles recordings that had been never heard by the public. John Barnett was an engineer at Abbey Road Studios. As part of his job, he made some backups of some precious Beatles material. Some of those backups somehow made their way to a Dutch collector who paid $20,000 for them. He then resold them to Dieter Schubert, a German Beatles fan. Schubert believed that these tapes were fair game since they were made before Germany ratified an international copyright agreement called the Rome Convention in 1966. Therefore, he asserted, the music was in the public domain and up for grabs for free. This was known as the protection gap, something that made enforcement of copyright tricky in certain territories. Schubert created a bootleg label called Swingin' Pig, and in 1988 set about manufacturing a series of CDs featuring, well, ultra-rare tracks from the Beatles. Fans loved these CDs. Now remember, the Beatles had only started releasing music on CD a year earlier, and some of those first legitimate Beatles CDs sounded absolutely awful. Engineers simply took the master tapes used to press vinyl and used them to make CDs. And you can't do that because the technical requirements to make a good-sounding CD are much different than what's needed to make a good-sounding piece of vinyl. The ultra-rare tracks sounded better than the official versions. Songs like Strawberry Fields Forever and I Saw Her Standing There were much better sounding on the bootlegs. Dieter Schubert ran out of material to release after half a dozen or so volumes. A lot of what he released was subsequently officially issued by EMI as anthologies, reissues, and box sets, which fans love, of course, and they become a major source of revenue. But we might not have heard any of this material if fans like Dieter Schubert hadn't forced the industry's hand. Okay, let's go back to the protection gap. Because there used to be a lot of ambiguity and inconsistency from country to country when it came to copyright protection, bootleggers had sanctuaries where they could set up shop. Until Germany got its act together with the international community, it was home to plenty of pirates. Same with Italy. I've seen bootlegs that were manufactured in places like the Principality of San Marino, Singapore, and Australia. In the 1990s, a label called Kiss the Stone emerged. It was run by a guy named Giorgio Serra, a record producer, and someone who went by the handles Gabs2 and A1112717. KTS's specialty was releasing unofficial and unauthorized live recordings. It also had a spin-off label called Big Music, and also Nico Records, aimed at the Japanese market. It had a staff of photographers and designers in a division called Technograph, who helped the label live up to its promise of the highest quality bootlegs possible. The company was originally based in Italy and legally existed as the result of a strange loophole. The company, under Italian law, could sell all the bootleg CDs they wanted if they placed all the necessary royalties in an escrow account and promised the funds would be paid out to the rights holders someday. Artists almost never bothered looking for money because it was too much trouble to track down escrow accounts in foreign countries. The protection gap was sealed for most of the world with the new international copyright treaty that went into effect on January 1st, 1995. And that, frankly, was the beginning of the end for most physical bootleg labels. Then there's the criminal element, which was always lurking in the background. There's the Triple Frontier, the area in South America where Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay share a border. Reports say that Al-Qaeda operates in that region, raising money from not only the sale of fake CDs and records, but also knockoff purses and watches. There were reports that the Irish Republican Army was also using the proceeds from the sale of bootleg records to fund its activities. And then we have the countries where no one seems to bother enforcing laws regarding copyright or intellectual property. The United States issues an annual report called the Notorious Markets List, which calls out countries that, shall we say, are lax in their enforcement when it comes to all manner of pirated goods. The list includes China, Russia, Vietnam, Indonesia, Iraq, Romania, Ukraine, Bulgaria, Cambodia, India, Mexico, Peru, the Philippines, Paraguay, Turkey, Malaysia, Argentina, Brazil, Jordan, the Czech Republic, and more. And the physical bootleg industry continues to employ thousands and cost legitimate holders of the rights to copyright and intellectual property. You just got to know where to find these things. And there's more. We haven't even started on the concept of digital music piracy. That is coming up next. Over the years, millions of people have been involved in music piracy by ripping and sharing music from CDs. But the average person is small potatoes. Let's look at some individuals who helped everyone steal digital files. The first thing that we need to understand is that compact discs contained unprotected digital data. Songs are preserved as WAV files. And by the mid-1990s, personal computers were coming with CD-ROM drives that were supposed to be used to install software like Windows 95. But it took about 10 seconds for some people to realize that the drives could also be used to transfer data, songs, from CD to a hard drive. Now, at first, this wasn't practical because the size of a song file was so big and hard drives of the day were so small. But then a new file format called MP3 appeared, thanks to the Fraunhofer Institute in Germany. MP3s weren't designed for sharing music, but the technology was recognized and easily adapted. A huge 80 megabyte file could be reduced to just 8 megabytes, which made it possible to store lots and lots of music on the hard drives of the day. And it also made it possible to transmit that smaller file across the internet to many other computers in a very efficient manner. Some hardcore music fan computer nerds really got into this. There was a loosely knit group called the Where Scene. These people had been around since the 1970s, communicating through old-style bulletin boards. Their thing was cracking software protection on things like games, porn, software, movies, and TV shows. But by the 1990s, the offshoots of this scene were into music. The most active of these offshoots was CDA, which is short for Compressed Audio. CDA was the first MP3 piracy group that we know of. And the first MP3 it ever shared was Until It Sleeps by Metallica. The date was August 10th, 1996.
So tear me open, pour me out. There's things inside that scream and shout, and the pain still hates me. So hold me until you sleep.
CDA was sometimes also known as rabid neurosis. Both groups came online around 1996, and neither CDA nor rabid neurosis had a single leader or organized structure, and members of the group were not allowed to communicate with each other. There was a character out in the Los Angeles area named Kali, who seemed to have some kind of administrative privileges. And there was a ripping coordinator in Pennsylvania who had the handle RST. Everyone who was part of the scene had the same mission. They competed over who could get pirated material out there before the other. The most prized thing was leaking an album that hadn't been released yet. Del Glover was a member of Rabid Neurosis, and he worked in a CD manufacturing plant in Kings Mountain, North Carolina. Starting in 1996, Del snuck unreleased CDs out of the plant. These are CDs that had yet to be shipped to stores. They went back to a shed he had set up in his backyard, where he eventually installed $2,000 worth of CD burners that allowed him to copy about 30 discs per hour. Del made a good living from selling CDR copies of the CDs he stole for maybe $5 a pop. He had a trusted circle of clientele. But then broadband internet was introduced. And when Napster came online in June 1999, demand for Glover's rips and for rips made by other competing pirates exploded. Del was able to quickly upload thousands of songs to the sites that fell under Rabid Neurosis. That included albums from Eminem, Kanye West, 50 Cent, U2, Destiny's Child, Mariah Carey, Jay-Z, Outkast, and dozens of others. Glover's supply chain was so good that he was given access to what was known as topsite servers. This is where all manner of pirated material was stored. They were in places like Hungary. This went on for years. By the end of 2006, it's estimated that Glover had leaked nearly 2,000 CDs. So if you were around back then and you were downloading this stuff, chances are you downloaded something that Del had stolen, ripped, and uploaded to the Rabid Neurosis servers. It all came to an end in January 2007. The Rabid Neurosis top sites started disappearing, and on January 9th, the very last CD was leaked. It was Infinity on High by Fall Out Boy. Although Rabid Neurosis had closed, Del Glover began working with another guy he knew only as Rick 1. This was the alias of a guy in Los Angeles named Adel Kassim. That lasted until September 12, 2007, when Del left work to find a couple of people from the sheriff's office and FBI waiting for him by his car. Over the next few months, other members of the scene were arrested. On September 9, 2009, Glover pleaded guilty to felony conspiracy to commit copyright infringement. To get a lighter sentence, he agreed to testify against Kassim. In the end, though, Kassim was found not guilty. This part of the scene, this Rabid Neurosis CDA thing, was all over. But these guys had cost the music industry tens of millions of dollars. Another notorious set of pirates were the people engaged with the Pirate Bay, an online index of thousands of digital files. The Pirate Bay didn't store any files, but they did facilitate connections between users with peer-to-peer software. The Pirate Bay was founded by three Swedish guys, Fredrik Nisch, Peter Sund, and Gottfried Skartholm. Sweden was always partial to piracy ever since the government made it a priority to provide broadband internet access to as much of the population as possible. This meant that the country got into illegal file sharing sooner and more deeply than most other nations. The Pirate Bay rose out of that ingrained habit Swedes had for, and there's no other way to put it, stealing music. The Pirate Bay first went online on September 15, 2003. The organizers realized that BitTorrent, a completely legal, very popular, and very useful communication protocol invented in 2001, was an excellent way to use, as they saw it, to set copyright free. The Pirate Bay was very upfront about their pirate activities. They were raided and sued time and time again, but somehow kept coming back. The principals were arrested, fined, and jailed repeatedly, but that didn't stop them. The Pirate Bay might go down for a few hours or a few days, but that was it. It would always pop up again from somewhere. There were more raids, domain seizures, domain blocking, delisting from search engines, arrests and court cases, and the Pirate Bay still exists. As of the end of 2024, the Pirate Bay is one of the top 10 most visited torrent sites in the world. And it's not just music. It's intellectual property that is supposed to be protected under international copyright laws. Another name for the world of music piracy is Kim Schmitz, although everybody knows him by the name Kim.com. He made that his legal name in 2005. .com is a German who first got started as a hacker and got arrested for the first time in 1994 on charges of computer fraud, data espionage, and tracking in stolen phone calling cards. That got him a 2-year suspended sentence. In 1998, he was deported from Thailand after being charged with embezzlement. There were problems in Hong Kong with a network of companies that worked illegally in the territory. And then in 2005, he started a file hosting service called Mega Upload. And this is .com's claim to infamy. Mega Upload, which .com operated from a home in New Zealand, flouted its disregard for copyrighted material and intellectual property. It was a file hosting and sharing site where anyone could share links for files that could be viewed and edited. At one point, the company grew to 150 employees and had revenues of $175 million. At its biggest, Mega Upload was the 13th most popular site on the internet and responsible for an incredible 4% of all internet traffic. But there was more. .com had a strange relationship with the mayor of Auckland that looked pretty shady. There were also charges of racketeering, money laundering, and wire fraud. In the process, it looks like he made millions upon millions of dollars, most of which were spent on a mansion, at least 18 luxury cars, expensive art, and yachts. Eventually, his home in New Zealand was raided in 2012. Among all the other things found was $175 million in cash. His bank accounts were frozen. There were at least 64 of them around the world. And the U.S. demanded that he be extradited to face charges. He managed to string that out until August 2024, when that extradition order was signed. This guy's a real piece of work, and we might have to do an entire show on him because we just scratched the surface. Here's one more infamous music pirate. In 2000, Mark Gorton created a file-sharing program he called LimeWire. LimeWire was so popular that by 2007, it was estimated to have been installed on 1/3 of all the personal computers on the planet. Record labels went after Gorton and LimeWire, and on October 26, 2010, a judge issued an injunction against the company. The Recording Industry Association of America not only wanted LimeWire shut down, but for Gorton and the organization to pay some damages. Damages of $72 trillion. Yes, trillion. $72 trillion is higher than the combined GDP of every country on the planet. Fortunately, though, for Gorton, that was negotiated down to just $105 million. Versions of LimeWire are still active, including something called the original LimeWire Pirate Edition. There's also an affiliated program called MewWire. The pirating of music has decreased substantially since the rise of streaming. Why bother to go through all the hassle of stealing something when you can get high-quality audio for free or something close to it? Yet the problem still persists in different forms, like stream ripping, where people record songs streamed from, say, Spotify or YouTube and make them available online for free. The United States also maintains their notorious markets list, which, again, calls out countries around the world for doing a terrible job protecting copyright for all sorts of things, including music. Then there are pirates who claim songs for themselves, posting them on streaming sites under their fake names, which allows them to collect royalties. Same problems, different clothing. Music piracy is as old as recorded music itself, and it's not going to be wiped out anytime soon. If you have any questions or comments about anything you hear on this podcast, shoot me an email, alan@alancross.ca. We can also meet up on all the social media sites along with my website, which is a journalofmusicalthings.com. It's updated with music news and recommendations every day. And there's the daily free newsletter that you should get. And please check out my other podcast, The Ongoing History of New Music, which deals with rock music at large. There are hundreds and hundreds of episodes that you can enjoy for free. No bootlegging required. See you next time with more stories of crime and mayhem in the music industry. Episodes arrive every 2 weeks. Technical productions by Rob Johnston. I'm Alan Cross.